Welcome to the Thriving Farmer Podcast. I'm your host, Michael Kilpatrick. Our mission is to inspire, educate, and celebrate sustainable farming. We believe that you can build a profitable, sustainable farm that gives you true farm freedom. Join us as we talk to farmers, innovators, educators, and entrepreneurs to glean their top takeaways in business and life. Hey, Thriving Farmers, I wanted to let you know that we have a pop-up swag shop that just opened to help you show the world your commitment to growing food, enjoying the land, and feeding your community. So we've got a bunch of different t-shirts. We've got some with just the Thriving Farmer logo. We've got a couple other ones, some that say build your farm, love your life, farm, eat, sleep, repeat. And then a couple other ones. They are available in men's and women's cuts. We've even got youth and toddler sizes as well. So we're leaving the swag shop only open up for a few days, and you'll want to go to www.growingfarmers.com/swag. Again, that's www.growingfarmers.com/swag. And you'll see all the t-shirts there. And again, we only got open for a few days, so make sure you head on over there today and grab your t-shirts. Hey, Thriving Farmers, Michael Kilpatrick here. Today, joining us on the podcast is Javan Bernakevitch, who is a regenerative land designer and educator in British Columbia. He has worked on land-based project design, management, training, and installation throughout Western Canada, the USA, Cuba, and East Africa. He also works with ecologically minded folks on designing their lives to work with, not against, their nature. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much, Michael. It's a pleasure to be here.
So what do you focus your energy on these days?
Well, I think we were just having a laugh that I tend to have a lot of fingers in a lot of different pies and working on a lot of projects. So these days I'm working with several farmers and land-focused clients, both in an urban and a rural context, working on evaluation, feasibility, enterprise design, land design, pasture restoration. I'm also working with about a dozen life design clients, either helping them clarify their values and make decisions based on those values, or exploring and clarifying limiting beliefs, behaviors, and patterns, or doing long-term mentorship. There's a few clients I've been working with for going on a year and a half, and helping them in their respective enterprises, be it syntropic agriculture or soil consultancy. I also teach for Oregon State University in both the climate resilience program and the regenerative land design program. And recently I was contracted to do another documentary. So right now I'm directing, writing, and video editing a feature-length documentary on watershed restoration. And at the same time, I take care of about 400 acres and improving systems there. And I think that's the short list. Well, I think we'll start there.
Yes. That is so fascinating, that the kind of documentaries that we are in this day and age, we're actually starting to think are actually worth making. Mm-hmm. Just 10 years ago, I think some of this stuff people wouldn't have had a thought about it. But I looked through the fire documentary you did, and we'll get to that at the end of the podcast here. I want to talk about that more then. But I'm just so enthused that we're starting to do science of this in our day and age.
Yeah, I think there is a growing number of folks who are waking up to the idea that even though we've had 250 years of industrial revolution, we're still ecology. We still come from ecology, and the better we understand our ecology, the better we understand ourselves, and the better living we can have.
Absolutely. So talk to us about your background. How did you get started in design?
Yeah, I think, first and foremost, humans have been working in design as far as we know since the cognitive revolution 70,000 years ago. I think everyone has an element of adapting their environment to them. If you've ever moved a chair or a table to make sure that it works for you, you've been involved in design in some way, shape, or form. I got myself into land design roughly about 10 years ago. And it was really based on my upbringing and my eligibility. I talk a lot about this with clients, is what are you eligible for? And in a land design context, that has to do with climate and soil and enterprises and regulations. From a life design standpoint, it depends on what you were innately gifted with. And my gift in many ways was I was born in Alberta. which
Mhm.
if folks don't know the province, it's kind of like Montana and Texas had a one-night stand.
Yes.
It's bigger, better buck and lone rugged woodsman with like a really healthy dose of like CIA skepticism. Like,
Yes. And it's cold.
and it has some coldness to it. Yeah, I moved up to Edmonton during a minus 55 Celsius cold snap
Oh,
without wind
wow.
chill. So it's got some coolness to it. But I grew up in construction. My father had a construction business. I worked with him for about 10 years. Got myself into environmental education and working with Alberta parks, and started working with a company called Riverwatch in Edmonton, taking kids down the North Saskatchewan River, which goes right through the city of Edmonton, has one of the largest parks in North America, right in the city.
Wow.
And I just realized that I wasn't having the effect I wanted to. I wanted to have a greater effect and have a more positive effect on my environment. So I moved out to the coast, moved out to Vancouver Island on the west side of British Columbia, which is the westernmost province in Canada, and moved into an eco village and started to learn about natural building because I had already had construction experience.
Mhm.
So I took this course in natural building, and at the end they said, we have this thing called a permaculture design course. Do you want to take it? Well, back in Edmonton, I had a friend of somebody who lived in the house come to stay for a weekend, and we had to ask her to move out 2 months later. And she was really into permaculture. So
Mhm.
I thought they were offering me a course in mooching. And I was good. I didn't need it. And then they said, but it's half price. And that Albertan in me, the one that, looking for a deal, was like, okay,
Yes.
I got to do it. And so I went into the course, and I was floored by the prime directive to take responsibility for ourselves and for that of our children. That made good sense to me. That wasn't
Mhm.
out there or too crazy. To take care of the earth, because that's where all of our assets come from. Yeah, that makes good sense. To take care of the
Mhm.
people, because that's how we access those assets and redistribute them. That makes sense. And then to set limits to our consumption and redistribute the surplus back into the people and back into the earth. And I thought, super skeptical, pretty pragmatic Albertan. I thought, okay, so when does this get weird? Like, when does the so-called woo-woo come into it?
Mhm.
And I just jumped in head, hands, and feet, as my Cuban compatriots would say. And from that moment on, I worked in design for landscapes, for ponds. I was able to go down to Cuba and learn and grow and teach down there, and was able to go to Eastern Africa and work over there. I was able to consult with people internationally. And basically every single year I've tried to be a little bit more smarter, a little bit more intelligent. And it's really come down to how then do I assess the existing nature and work within it? That's probably become the big keystone or the linchpin in the work.
Mhm. Because that existing is always changing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I mean, we're recording this in March, and the coronavirus is literally just wiping its way across the US right now.
Mm-hmm.
Talk to us a little bit about that. How does that change the context that we're in?
Well, the great thing about context, and if we use the idea of context, what is the situation we are in, and using both concepts of time. So there's the theory of linear time called chronos,
Mhm.
and then there's the theory of time of immediacy of time called kairos, both Greek words. And kairos is the immediacy of an issue. So there's another concept called white rhinoceroses, which is comparing to black swans from Nassim Nicholas Taleb's Black Swans being things that we can't necessarily predict, but after the fact after the fact of these big impactful events, we will completely and utterly justify and say, oh yeah, we knew it was coming.
Mhm.
Whereas white rhinoceroses are things that we can completely predict, have predicted, and just haven't prepared for.
Mhm.
And mutable pathogen and changing pathogen is something that we have seen growing over the last at least century, if not in earnest over the last 2 decades. And the mutability of the pathogen and the playing with pathogen and the working with pathogen, we still don't know, and we probably never will,
Mhm.
how COVID-19 came to bear, because of course coronavirus is a whole family of
Mhm.
viruses,
Mhm.
including the
Yeah.
common cold. So really, we're talking about this novel coronavirus of COVID-19. Um, and this is one of the things that I love best about Bill Molleson's work, is that we have to be time scouts. We have to play with this wonderful mutability, this variable mutability of time. And we need to look at time and say, yeah, there's a chance we're going to get a virus or a bacterial infection or a fungal infection that generally looks at an incredible source and a host of material and goes, well, if there's 4.5 billion of this host on the planet, let's try and adapt to them, and let's make sure that we can change and grow as quickly as possible with them. So, COVID is a great example of how, when we don't realize and we don't take into effect that while we might be working on farm, while we might be working in landscape, there are other elements of life that are constantly pushing on. We forget that those elements exist, and we don't include them into our design structure. So a number of clients I work with, we work on a fair amount of sustenance. We work on how can we be located inside a land base for an extended period of time. And that's always been a part of my design work, as has fire. All of these things have to do with it, because it's not just a farm. When I talk to folks who really understand land and work with land, they realize that we are of the land. And I don't mean that in an airy-fairy hallmark sort of way. We are ecology. We've tried to separate ourselves from it, but we are ecology, which means that if we invest in land and we work with land and we move against the tide of the last 30 years of moving from rural landscapes into urban landscapes, then we tend to increase the amount of resiliency or the anti-fragile nature that we have as people.
Let's talk a little bit about land design, because you just talked about that, and it's something I know you do a lot of. What would you say your philosophy is around that? What do you focus on?
Yeah, I think Masanobu Fukuoka put it best: when you throw Mother Nature out the window, she comes back with a pitchfork. So best to work with. And my way of working has been influenced by the incredible number of people I've worked with, my mentors, my colleagues. And so, this is just what I've come to from synthesizing all of their work. But I really take a look at three circles in a Venn diagram. I take a look at the inherent ability or inherent characteristics of a land base. And for that, I work with the P.A. Yeoman scale of permanence, which has been updated by Darren Doherty into the Agrarians platform. And I've modified a bit as I like to use it. And I use that to assess and diagnose. And by diagnosis, I mean, what is the root cause? Not just what is this label of symptoms, which is how most of our diagnosis works with the healthcare system. Nobody really knows what causes asthma, but they're going to call your collection of symptoms asthma without giving you a root cause. So I really focus on the root cause. Where are we having weak links within this system from a land-based perspective? So that's the first circle in this Venn diagram. The second circle is the client themselves. And this may be a single, this may be a group of people, this may be an organization, but understanding their values, understanding their wants, understanding their needs, understanding what they have to give to the project in time, money, and energy, how much time they want to work on a project. All of that creates the context, if you will, of what's possible for them working on that landscape. And third, and I wish it wasn't true, but we live in regulatory environments. The third circle is regulations. Lots of people go through novel land regeneration enterprises or businesses or workshops, and they come out thinking, well, I'm going to do what they did, not realizing that they're not in the same regulatory environment. We're going to talk about some work in like Kenya compared to Canada later on, and that's one of the big differences. You can pretty much do anything you want, as long as the landowner says so, and usually the local chief is in agreement. But in Canada, the stipulations are quite different. And so those three, the potential of the land, the potential of the client, and the potential of the regulatory body, that overlap in the center of those three circles creates the sweet spot, the place where we find small entries, small things to change. And so I really focus on weak links, opportunities, threats, strengths, and then really looking at existing ecology, both of the human mind. The climate of the mind is one of the hardest things to change, and also the climate on the landscape. And just as P.A. Yeoman set out, there are some things that take more time and effort to change. And so we focus on those first, and we make sure that the enterprises, the decisions, the design fit inside those boxes. Because if they don't, you're going to take up a lot of time and energy as the implementer. I had had a client call up years ago, and they wanted to create a haskap farm, honeyberry farm over on the west side of Vancouver Island. Well, haskaps are native to very cold regions. They need a lot of chill hours, and we've got a temperate climate on the west coast of Vancouver Island. And I just said, listen, you're not inside your climate in terms of the rules of the game, so to speak. You're not inside that climate. You're going to be pushing uphill the whole time. And he kept on pushing and pushing and pushing. And later on, I found out he did indeed purchase a piece of land and put in a bunch of berries, and ended up losing half of them because he just wasn't working within the rules of the game, so to speak. So really, most of the rules that are in front of us are already laid out. And this isn't to say we shouldn't push against some rules, or we shouldn't have civil courage and try and do things that are important. But it also means that really taking the time to observe and diagnose and see what's feasible. This is something that I do quite a bit. I see what the land, the client, and the regulatory climate makes that specific piece of land with those specific type of people on it. What are they eligible for? And that makes all the difference in terms of how much life and energy you have towards a farm or a piece of land. Because if you're working against that, that's pushing a boulder uphill for the rest of your life.
Okay, so there's two things that, from what I just heard you say, the one thing that I want to ask further about is, you're saying you're working on obviously the short term, but also there's that long term aspect that that the land is capable of. So you're also thinking about that long term aspect, whereas you're not right now focusing on the short term. Okay.
Yeah, so we look at both. So first and foremost, I was just up in northern British Columbia. You talk about the amazing change that we're having these types of documentaries. Well, I had a forestry company bring me up to northern British Columbia to talk about advents of water distribution through the Keyline Plan as outlined by PA Yeomans, which is incredible for a forestry company to do that.
Oh, absolutely.
In the afternoon, we did these curiosity consults, and I call them curiosities because I've only got half an hour with folks. I don't have the months that I take to do feasibility, or the months I take to understand a site. All I can do is have them bring the information I've asked of them, and then to really say, well, I'm curious about this, and I'm curious about that, and take a look at it. And there's this one farmer there who, she had quite a number of enterprises going on the farm, and she had quite a number of things going on in her life. And when we got down to the two real profit generating enterprises, both lamb and broilers, she was having a little bit of an issue. The broilers weren't exactly making profit. The lamb was, but it was harder to sell in her local market. And I just took her back. She was an ecologist. And I just said, listen, what is the ecology of this site? What is the climax blueprint? And sure enough, it's mostly ungulate based when you take a look at fauna. So we're taking a look at Bovidae and Cervidae, and we have a history, we have a native history of having those types of animals do really well there. In terms of production fowl, not really. The landscape isn't set up for that to start off with. Could you change that landscape to be productive with chickens? Sure. But generally, it's always going to be an input. You're always going to be inputting into that land over what the land already wants to do or already provides for a browser or a grazer like sheep. And by understanding that, we take in both the long and the short term. This is a long-term decision and a short-term decision. Sure, you could do chickens, you could do guinea pigs, you could do, a host of other things, but what is the land inherently already supporting natively? And then what kind of domesticated production, livestock or crops are we going to work with to then have that be expanded? And then the long term then becomes, in terms of what she wants for her life, what she wants for her family and her children, how then do we make that life as spectacular for her and make the farming practice as boring as possible? And I mean boring in the fact that I don't want to see 45 different novel experiments on a farm every single year. I want to see one or two simple, replicable enterprises that are pretty boring to manage, and then one or two experiments that really start to push the boundaries to see what's possible in the years to come.
I like that. Boring farming. I've just never experienced that because I just have like 9,000 things going on at once. So the other thing you said there, which is interesting, is the capacity of the mind, I think, of the client, or like
Mhm,
where that state is. Now,
mhm.
obviously you have to evaluate them at their current point, but do people change? I mean, what's the capacity that you see after working with clients for so many years? What is that capacity for change?
Yeah, I think, you know, we'll talk about this later on, but I've started to get into wildland firefighter training
Hmm.
and wildland fire lighting training. And in the States in particular, there's a history of when you start one of these trainings, they talk about the open mindset and the fixed mindset.
Hmm.
Are you coming to this training with an open mindset, i.e., I know what I know, but I'm open to learning something new? Are you approaching this as I do, with firm beliefs but loosely held? I
Hmm.
know what I know, but I'm open to having them change. And do I have an open toolbox and an open mind? And so the clients that come to the work that I do with that mindset do exceptionally well.
Hmm.
They're open to changing how they look at soil. They're open to changing how they look at life. Healthy soil is 66% airspace.
Hmm.
It's a
Hmm.
cathedral. It has arches and open areas, and all of that is for life to live and for transpiration and evapotranspiration to happen. And as I was talking with a potential new client who just gave me a ring the other day, as we were talking about soil, I heard him go, "Oh, I never thought of it that. Wow, that
Hmm.
makes really good sense. I've seen that happen on my landscape," as I was talking about my
Hmm.
understanding of soil. And that made me know that he was eligible for working together. A big part of my work is seeing if it's a good fit. And
Hmm.
a lot of the clients that come to me, potential clients, and they go, "I know what I'm doing. I just need to know where to put X."
Uh-huh.
I tend to say we're probably not a good fit, because
Hmm.
fundamentally I come from a value set and from a belief system that looks at land as lots of interacting elements that have their own uh, understanding and speciation to them even. And so that climate of the mind, that really makes the eligibility for the entire landscape. I worked with a couple clients years ago, and she was the main driving factor for the farm. She was also a recent mother. They were trying to have a second child, and he was interested in farming, but generally didn't want to work more
Hmm.
than 10 hours on the farm a week, and would most likely like to drive something
Yeah.
that that consumes some sort of
Yes. Yes.
petroleum product.
Yes. Had a diesel engine.
Yeah, right. And you see this, and that's fine.
Yes.
But at the same time, you've got a primary farmer who's also a primary caregiver and is about to have a second child.
Hmm.
A big part of my analysis of that farm was, you need to throttle down. You need to work with perennial species that you have to tend once or twice a year.
Hmm.
I would scrap the annual gardening outside of maybe squash,
Hmm.
or garlic, or things that don't take a lot of tending, because you don't have a lot of time to give.
Hmm.
And what a lot of people do is they get onto a farm and they think, great, I know what farming is from all these beliefs and stories and conversations I've seen on the internet or I've had with other people. And they try to apply those stories to their farm, never
Hmm.
considering that who they are will actually dictate their farm far greater than what anybody else has ever said about their own personal farm.
Absolutely. Hmm. Yeah. This is something I've actually had experienced myself lately as we've scaled the business, the podcast and our Growing Farmers brand. I haven't had the time to do what I want to do outside. So I've
Mm.
had to scale back our farm to the point that we're getting a CSA share from our local farmer that I work with. And we're switching most of our production to some woodies and some larger scale field cropping, just
Hmm.
because it's not with lettuce, you're out there several times a week.
Hmm.
And the stuff that I'm moving to, I'm out there like a couple times a month.
Yeah. Yeah.
So no, that is a really a good point there. So let's talk about different projects. You talked about the Kenya, differing from BC and just like, the regulation, but what are some of the other ways you see those differ?
You know, something about nations that are not as affluent or haven't benefited from petroleum, the excess of petroleum as North America has.
Mm-hmm.
And for folks that are interested in conversations like that, I really recommend the book, The Energy of Slaves, as well as as well as Homo Deus by Yuval Harari, both really set out when you have excess energy, it changes the mindset of the people.
Mhm.
And when you have less energy to work with, it also changes the mindset of the people. I remember listening to a man from Vietnam speaking about living in North America and which was better, the village life or the North American life. And they had to say that, hard choices, easy life, easy choices, hard life. And it's
Hmm.
something about the nature of voluntary hardship or put upon or forced hardship that creates a very resilient mindset. And when there's opportunity, it's taken up really quickly. And I
Mhm.
found that in Kenya and Uganda and Cuba, even when we came in to work with a couple of farmers or an organization, there was such an incredible amount of enthusiasm. There was such
Mhm.
an incredible amount of let's make this happen, to the point to where the project we did in 2013 took just a handful of days and is still producing food to this day, and is still producing um, tree seedlings, and is still
Mhm.
storing and holding water, because the motivation was there to direct all that human initiative and that human labor. Whereas in North America, I find that the motivation is always tempered because we have such an array of options. There's
Mhm.
so much to distract us and to take us on, that individuals generally in North America are very distracted in an urban context, less so in a rural. And then when you get into a really removed or sort of an outback rural, then you change again and you start seeing that same mindset you see in Kenya and Uganda, where people are like, well, what can we do and how can we make it happen? And
Mhm.
there's a lot of motivation. There's a lot of physical stamina as well. So the projects change in that there's a lot of thinking, there's a lot of deliberating, there's a lot of contemplating and regulatory evaluating here in North America. And internationally, depending on where you are, definitely places like Kenya, Uganda, and Cuba, we do a lot of deliberating, we do a lot of analysis and diagnosis, but once the mind is made up, the shovels are in the ground and we're
Mhm.
starting to transform a landscape really, really quickly.
Would you say that in, let's say, North America, you have almost death by learning? Is just they're constantly learning or constantly doing something different? They just never quite actually do anything?
I think that's a byproduct. I definitely think that's true,
Mm.
but it's a byproduct. Our generation was told you can do anything and be anything, which
Mhm.
is inherently really bad advice.
Yes.
It's terrible advice. It means that the genius of the child is going to be scattered out into a myriad of subjects instead of that core essence that we're all born with. And we're all born with a different essence, a different push. It's our personality. It's who we are. It's what we do. And instead of allowing universities and schools to nurture whatever that little seed is and grow into an incredible expression of that, we end up instead having factory making processes of learning that really produce pretty standardized individuals and humans. And I think this is
Mm.
where so many people in the homeschooling world have really seen what's possible when you allow
Mhm.
a child to develop their own understanding. And this is true inside and outside. I make no difference between an artist and a farmer. It's
Mm.
somebody who's really inside of their incredible love. I love biography, and I just dove into Billie Eilish and her brother. I want to say Finnegan, but I think it's Phineas or something like that.
Okay. Yeah.
But the big thing there is that they loved music. Their parents invested in them with music. They could stay up past their bedtime if they were making music. And
Mhm.
here's two incredibly young people who have really taken music by storm because they have invested in it. Well, what if we had a similar thing for a young boy or a young girl who just loves being outside and loves being in nature and working with nature? What would that individual become if we allowed that to be the prime motivating factor for their education?
Mhm.
So we go back to your comment, death by learning or death by analysis. And I think it's a byproduct of our educational process. Instead of continually saying, well, what's out there, I instead invite folks who might be in that mindset to say, what's in there, what's inside of me that's so excited to be expressed, and start to nurture and grow that, and find a lot of alignment and being within that and exploring that, and then finding where you end up. Find your curiosities and chase them down has really been a big part of my life, and
Mm-hmm.
it's how I got into documentary filmmaking. I wanted to explore it, but as I've explored it and done as much as I can for it, I found a return surplus. People have said, wow, that was great. Could you help me with mine? Hey, have you
Mm-hmm.
thought about doing this? And yet I'm still doing land design, still doing life design, but really chasing down those curiosities, I think, is a great way to inoculate yourself against the paralysis by analysis, or the, deadening of action by learning.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Wow. Talk to us about some of the more memorable projects that you've done over the years.
Yeah, for sure. It's, they've been both land and life. I think probably one of my most recent favorite projects that's uh, life focused but land based is a pair of farmers down in the States that had kind of gotten to where they wanted to get to with their non-for-profit they were working for, and
Okay.
by coming back to their values as a couple, and then deciding what's the values they want out of their farming, because they are two people who are producers, right? Through and
Mm-hmm.
through. They've come back to it after, making it through the grinder mill that is our educational system. And they really came down to, no, we're farmers and we want to do it, but this type of farming is really not serving us. So we took a look at their values-based process. We took a look at what was important to them about farming. We already knew what was important to them as people and as a couple, but what's important to them about farming. And then we basically held up their current farming situation to their values, and we tried to pass it through like a filter. Like what
Mm-hmm.
went through that in their current situation that worked well, and what didn't. And then what didn't, what would it have to look like to be amazing?
Yeah.
And so we ended up with this really interesting proposal about their farm situation, but it wasn't quite right. And in a moment of pure invention and ideation, when you're looking at this long enough, we came up with this idea. I had come up with it, thinking about it during the week that they had come up with it. It was this really cool moment of almost mirror neurons. And they said,
Yeah.
well, what if we were private farmers that farmed the non-for-profit land, but were separate, and they made bulk purchases from us? So instead of trying to work within the non-for-profit lens, what if we just became rock star farmers like we want to, without
Mm-hmm.
having to deal with a lot of the non-for-profit
Constraints.
thank you.
I've been
um,
inside some of them.
yeah. And when they finally passed that on to the non-for-profit was thrilled. They said,
Mm-hmm.
wow, this is actually a solution to some of our problems as well. And so now they're in this 2, 3, 4-year transition of seeing if it's even possible and profitable.
Mm-hmm.
But the great thing is by the end of that time period, they are going to accurately know if it's possible. And if it isn't, they're going to know exactly how to run their farm if they decide to leave, which is most likely what they might do
Mm-hmm.
if it doesn't work out. So, from a life land design, that was a really cool project. Another cool project was pre-purchase assessment, which is something that I do, where you get somebody who really wants to start a farm, or wants to start a community, or wants to start a homestead, and they're just trying to find the right piece of land for them. And so I was approached by a tiny house builder up here in Canada, and they were looking for the right piece of land. And this landowner had 3,000 acres in a little valley, and they were offering them one little section to potentially lease for 99
Mm-hmm.
years. And so we went through the process, and it wasn't too bad, but it ended up being taken back. They said, actually, we have other plans for it. And so they ended up showing my client a different piece of land. Well, I ended up going through my due diligence and found out that the rock slide that's actually quite close to there is underneath them.
Oh, no.
And you can't, it's very hard to dig a well
Yeah.
underneath that. And so instead I took a step back and I said, listen, mate, let me take a look at the 3,000 acres. Let me evaluate the entire area, which I've done before,
Mm-hmm.
either at a province scale or a country scale, and just kind of understanding where might be a great place for somebody to live. Let me find a couple of spots that make good sense, that are outside of the major threats and weaknesses of the area, that have good strengths for all the thing you want. And so I found 3 areas, 3 sweet spots, passed along an amazing sweet spot to the client. They ended up finding that it was actually somebody else who owned it, who had already purchased a lease off of this major landowner, purchased it for a really good price,
Mm-hmm.
and is now really happy with that piece of land. And when you think about the fact that land is probably one of the largest purchases we're ever going to make, a little bit of insurance, a little bit of investment to ensure that you're making a really good choice pays itself back in dividends. And him and his family have been really happy with that. So, both of those have been great projects. The projects that are land-based that I really love, there's one locally where we were working with a heritage producer of chicken. And the main problem was we live in an amazing rain shadow, which increases the amount of rain that we have in our local area. And they bought a piece of land that was deforested. So water was pumping out of this land. And so the challenge was, how do we turn water into chicken? How do we take that water, produce vegetation that then produces chicken? And we were able to raise their dozen price by, I think it was 150%. We were able to raise their chicken price. We were able to sell them out. It was just an amazing experience of really evaluating them in their context and then working within that. And sometimes a big portion of that, especially with them, was working with their beliefs about how they valued their food. And if their food itself was valuable and if they had value to offer. And so some of that was actually interpersonal work, which I've found more and more is necessary in working with producers.
So part of it was just having them believe in the value of what they're producing and then figuring out how to tell that story in the marketplace.
And before that, going to where those beliefs started and starting to work those out. Because if you don't get to that root, anybody who's pulled pernicious weeds knows if you don't pull that root, you're dealing with the vegetative issue forever. So once we had found the blockages, we then started to construct a new narrative about their own beliefs about value and then tell that story well. And then, yes, indeed, it had a financial return.
Absolutely. So as our climate changes, what is more important now more than ever to be integrated into design?
To change with the climate.
Okay.
I help with a climate resiliency program with Oregon State University. We have probably 30 to 40 students a year. And that whole program is about working with, trialing crops and livestock with a changing climate. The second thing is to realize that water vapor plays a fundamental role in our climate that is not spoken about. And Walter Yenny, he's really brought this to the forefront as both a microbiologist and a climate scientist to really understand that, 80% of the natural greenhouse effects result from water vapor in the atmosphere. And 95% of the heat dynamics on our blue planet is through water. You can spin the globe to the point to where you cannot see land. If anybody's played around with Google Earth Pro, you can spin the globe and you can't see land. And then when you spin it on the other side, there's land and water. Water plays a fundamental role in how the thermodynamics of our planet is regulated. A gram of water can hold up to 590 calories of energy. So understanding that water has to play an essential element in our landscapes is essential to moving forward. We've dehydrated our landscapes to the point to where we don't necessarily have more cloud cover, but we do have more haze. We have water that hasn't yet precipitated into clouds due to the fact that we've lost 50 to 80% of what seeds clouds, which is microscopic organisms that live underneath the sides of leaves. And then once we lose the trees, we lose those microscopic organisms. And this information over the last couple of years has fundamentally changed the way that I look at our climate and I look at a changing climate. If I had money and time to put into it, which I do, and I put into water retention landscapes of having water stored high in the landscape that passively takes the longest path and bumps into the most amount of materials and really creates a lot of fertility in the landscape, and doing as much as I can with my own piece of property that I help to steward, as much as I do with anybody else's landscape. So, climate change really has to do with changing with the climate as it has always changed. We had a marketing guru change it from global warming into climate change to make it less alarming to folks, which is unfortunate. But to really understand that the driving factors of some of this change are not just carbon or not just pollution, but has a lot to do with ecological degradation, has to do with the fact that we've lost 50 to 70% of all life on this planet in just the history of humans being on the planet, and that we really do need to start sinking and creating these water dependent landscapes.
Okay, so one of the biggest thing you'd say is just make sure you're capturing that water at all levels.
That's right. And the farmers I was just with in northern British Columbia here, they all had the same problem. They have water when they don't need it, and they don't have water when they need it. And this harkens back to folks like Mark Shepard talking about growing things that want to die and killing things that want to live. We're fundamentally, generally in terms of human nature, wired, and not wired, but taught backwards. Why don't we work with what's existing? Well, water naturally wants to fall in our landscape, and that water naturally wants to be stored on our landscape. So let's store it. And if we store it in soil, fantastic. 1% of organic matter increase on an acre is anywhere between 10 to 20,000 gallons of storage. It's the cheapest way to store water. If we have to go into earthworks, ponds, or other types of structures, so be it. But if we don't manage that watershed, and normally we only have our land to operate with our watershed, then it'll be managed for us. And generally, these flywheels of dehydration will continue on and continue to dehydrate our landscapes.
What would you say frustrates you most about how many design their farms today?
I go back to that idea of taking societal beliefs or taking rock star farmer beliefs or patterns and just stamping them onto a piece of land without any consideration for a person's individual beliefs or the patterns of that landscape. I worked with a farmer that was on 100 meters long and 30 meters in elevation gain or loss. That's massive. That's a steep
Oh my gosh, yeah.
And they were dragging a chicken tractor up and down this slope to the point to where they were considering an ATV or a quad bike to move this because they were wrecking their bodies. Well, no kidding. Of course. This is a tool and a technique that was built on the prairies, that was popularized by Joel Salatin and Polyface Farms and others. It's really not a mountainous, steep incline tool. And so I think, that mentality of find the recipe and stamp the recipe is really problematic. Instead, taking principles, understanding, okay, who am I as a person? What do I want on this land? What do I want to do with this land? And then starting to test. And this is through Alan Savory's holistic management decision-making framework, which I've modified, but it's still very much the core of what Alan put together. And really testing that. I did a young agrarians, which is close, similar to your green, what is it called? Green thumbs or green horns down there?
Yeah, I think it's, the greenhorns, and there's the something about the bicycle project. I'm not super close to them, but yeah.
But like young farmers, a group of young and upcoming farmers. They're called the young agrarians here. And I did a workshop with them, and I said, your beliefs fundamentally shape your farm. And I can guarantee you that you have at least a dozen that are not supporting the production on your farm today. And I paused. And I watched people's faces start to think about what their neighbors had told them, and their dads had told them, and their moms had told them, and grandma had told them, and the local extension agent had told them. And then I said, what are those beliefs? And everyone had them immediately. Wow. Immediately they had beliefs that they knew weren't working on their farm. And understanding those fundamental beliefs that don't fit your context is the first step into change, and to really good change. And awareness, when we take a look at change, is 10% of changing and adapting well. But it's a prerequisite. You need that first 10% of awareness. The next 30% is tools and techniques. And if you're doing the math, we haven't even crossed the 50 mark line. So the last 60 is integration. So you need to be aware of these beliefs and patterns. You need to have the tools and techniques to challenge these beliefs and patterns, and really start to observe the patterns that naturally exist on your landscape. And then actively integrate, actively work it out, actively do small experiments. Again, not 60 or 90 on a landscape, but 1 or 2. And if you're doing an experiment like, let's say, garlic, and you're saying, well, I'm just going to plant the garlic that everybody else plants. This was a great example from colleague Dakota Cohen of Cohen Family Farms.
Yep.
Instead of just planting the garlic that everybody else plants, year 1, year 2, year 3, do a shotgun approach, plant 12 or 13 varieties that you like, that you enjoy, and then start to have the climate and the growing conditions whittle those down to a few that are probably going to be season extensions, going to have novel characteristics, and also give you diversification in marketplace. But again, that's one experiment where you're having variability within, and you're challenging the belief that there's only one type of garlic that grows in your area.
Absolutely. So if there's like a magic reset button as it relates to starting a farm, what systems would you go back and see farmers put into place sooner rather than later?
Yeah, it's time for the broken record time of the interview, but it's values-based observation, assessment, and decision making. I have not seen a better tool in a landscape than knowing your values and knowing the values of the people you share the responsibility of managing that landscape with, to make sure you are on the same page. The number of people who've called me saying, hey, I've got this issue, and I listen to him and her, or him and him, or the family, or her and her, there's so many different combinations of people who farm. And I realized they do not share similar values, and that the dairy, the cannabis operation, the whatever, the production there has nothing to do with the production. The issues with production have nothing to do with the production. It has totally to do with the values that these, what's we call in holistic management, the primary decision makers, those that have veto, they are not aligned, and they've never spoken their values outwardly. One of the biggest pieces of feedback I get from couples is that this feels amazing to finally have our values on the same piece of paper. We have a shared context now. And once that happens, you can pass through any enterprise on that landscape to see if it's actually going to work with your values and who you are as a person. I've been working with a client in Western Europe, and they bought a piece of land and it has a number of ineligibilities for production on it, which is unfortunate. But they've been really trying to find an enterprise that might work on that piece of land, just trying to make it work. And so they've been interviewing a bunch of different producers with a standard set of questions that I use. And they came back from a flower operation, which had a number of issues. One, it was city-based. Two, it mostly did weddings because it was city-based. Three, it didn't supplement full income. But besides that, I went back to the client and I said, do you like growing flowers? They said, no. And so I get you want to save the piece of land. I get you don't want to, lose the investment. I totally get that. I've been in a place where I've lost a fair amount of money for making bad choices pre my work with values-based decision-making. I get that. But what are you going to do? Are you going to condemn yourself to a life of really servitude to an idea, not necessarily a person or a place, but this idea that I have to be a flower farmer to make my life work, instead of saying, this was a bad choice. I'm not gonna sink into a sunk cost fallacy bias, thinking I put money in, so I have to keep going. I'm going to get as much as I can out of this. It might be 60 cents on the dollar, and I'm going to go live a life I really enjoy. So I would say that would be the biggest one.
And I think that is actually so important for anyone who's looking to do something together in life, whether it be, life partners or business partners. But, that I think is so important, just to have that out there so you're both on the same page.
And going back to those farmers that were trying to make it fit with that non-for-profit. I worked with him years ago. We built a context together. We did some interpersonal work together. Right as he was getting serious about farming, he met his partner. They both came to me and said, we really want to do context together because we want to be on the same page. And then they came back to me a few years later to do this farming assessment.
Yeah. And
it's such a great example of every single step of the way, they were open to the idea of, maybe we don't know how to be in relationship. And I'm going to put my hand way up in the air. And up until the fact that I started to learn and assess about how to actually be in relationship with business partners, romantic partners, all the rest of it, I didn't really know. I didn't know how to be in good relationship. But this idea of values-based processes and really having those values on the same page really has fundamentally changed not only the way I work with people, but the the quality of life they have, the
Yeah.
productivity they have, the profit they have. It's a fundamental change.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. When you're both rowing the same direction, you actually can move the boat forward.
You know, some people row backwards, some people poke holes in the boat, some people are trying to throw you over. I love that metaphor because it really does show that if you are not moving in the same direction as the other person with the oar, you're not moving forward.
Mm-hmm.
And entropy, this force upon the universe, is always at play. It's always trying to pull us back down. So unless we are growing, we are at best stagnating, and at worst and more commonly, we're actually devolving. We're actually moving into entropy. We're moving into disrepair.
Oh, that's scary. All right, so let's move on to life design, because you keep
Sure.
on bringing that into this, which is great, because I geek out on this too. How does one really figure out what they're designed for?
Yeah, great, great example, or great question. And I think a big part of this, I was just saying this to a student the other day, with the Oregon State University folks. You know, so much of land design is sculpting, and we add and we subtract. You know, subtractive design is as important as additive design, which we'll get into. But it's working with a sculptor that is, or sculpture that is actively sculpting itself. And so there are essential elements of who we are. And I at the end of these design workshops, and I still do this one-on-one with clients, I developed a process called the zones of brilliance, based upon the permaculture zones, the idea that there are some zones we go to quite frequently. And there are areas that we just are naturally brilliant at.
Mm-hmm.
And by looking at one's natural gifts and inclinations and skills, you know, we were joking before we got on here, the 90 tabs that you have opened.
Yeah.
Those 90 tabs, your search history on YouTube, your search history on the web is an amazing source of analysis. When you really see what you're watching, when you really see what you're investing into, you get a really good sense of what you naturally want to be doing.
Mm-hmm.
And for a lot of folks who are into regeneration or into ecologically improving the planet, some of what they're interested in isn't exactly those elements. And it's interesting because they'll force themselves to be a certain way. They'll force themselves to be what they're being told to be. I presented at Permaculture Voices years ago when Diego Footer put that on, back in the first one. There's a gentleman who came to my presentation on Zones of Brilliance. And afterwards he came up and he said, you know, I was a mechanic before getting into all of this regenerative agriculture and permaculture. And I've tried to be a composter. I've tried to commercially compost, but I can't. I'm terrible at it. I suck at it. You let me know, you gave me permission to be a mechanic. I am a mechanic. I'm mechanically inclined. And I can be a permaculture mechanic, going back to Larry Santoyo talking about, you don't do permaculture, you use permaculture in what you do. I can be ecologically minded and try and move this forward, because all of these things are not going away. The multitude of humanity isn't going to change overnight and then, you know, become a hippie commune. That's not going to happen. It's just not. We might be forced to change by climate variability from things like mutable pathogens, but we're still going to have mechanics. We're still going to have programmers. We're still going to have folks that just love art. And so really understanding who we are and working within that essence and nurturing that essence, similar to what we talked about with homeschooling. Just be curious about your curiosities and explore them, and then double down on the things that really delight and alight you. You come off of speaking about something, as I do with life design, and you are buzzed in a way that caffeine could never do. That's a really great indicator that that's something you need to explore more. You need to develop more skill in. I've been so curious about interpersonal dynamics and belief systems that I've invested the last 3 years in really understanding beliefs, how we construct them, and how to work with them, and how to transition them into beliefs that work better for us, to the point to where I was, again, up north. This is quite fresh, so there's a lot of examples from it. But I sat down with this farmer. We were talking about their issues. We were talking about the land issues, and then we were talking about the interpersonal dynamics on the farm. I said, oh, that's really interesting. It sounds like there's a part of your father that really holds to what's important to them from their childhood, and probably has to do with their dad. And they blinked at me going, how did you know that? And when you invest in time and experience and assessment and diagnosis, you get a really good sense of these things. And so, how do you figure this out? You become really honest with yourself. What am I inclined to do? What am I naturally drawn to? You ask people close to you. Say, what do you see that I'm uniquely suited to, or I'm uniquely eligible for? And that can give you a few little pathways, sort of a grouping if you're using targeting lingo, to then look at and explore and to start to dive in deeper.
Okay. All right. So what does a holistic context mean to you? Because you talked about a little bit about that earlier.
Yeah. So holistic context, as it's been originally conceived of by Alan Savory, was understanding the value set of an organization and then making decisions based upon that value set. So for me, it's the biggest circle we can draw around an operation, an organization, a family, or an individual, and to understand the why of that whole, the people who are making that primary decision. The why do they get out of bed in the morning? It's what propels them forward, and use those values as a filter. Like obviously the growing farmers and the work you're doing with this, it propels you. You get excited. I can hear it in your voice. I see it in your posts. This is a really important thing to you. This is a core piece of you. It's a zone of brilliance. So making decisions, as you're talking about, on the farm based upon those values to make sure that you have an alive life that's super vital and has an incredible vital force and a vigor, allows us to move forward. So context is really taking the values of an individual or an organization, simplifying those to make them present tense. So, I spend time and have a great connection with my family. And then running decisions past those values to see if that decision is actually going to produce that effect. So we're going to take a vacation, but we're all going to do our own separate thing. Probably doesn't make a nice, close-knit family, right?
Now, I want to ask a question, something that you just said right there. So obviously, there will be times in your business where you won't be able to make those ideals, like that you won't be able to spend as much time with your family. But as long as you're moving in that direction, is that what you want to be working towards? Is that the kind of the context you want to kind of proliferate?
Yeah, it's a short and a long term. And so I've had recently I've got probably 6 clients right now that I'm walking through holistic life context, building their context for their life. And recently we just finished with a couple that were out of Belgium, and they had a decision to test, which was, should we get a smartphone? And we start with simple decisions so we can start to build capacity. We move up to, should I buy a $500,000 property really quickly because of the scalability of the process and the project. But we start off with, should I buy a smartphone? Now, in the short term, there was really no reason for it. This was the interesting part. This was a reverse piece where in the short term, they were saying, oh, it would help our consulting business. The consulting business they didn't have. They were developing that business. And I get that. But a phone does not a consulting business make. It is a tool that may or may not improve your business, and it may just be a big distraction.
It can be.
So we came out at the end of that actually this decision is probably not a good fit for this whole, them and their family right now. But when he goes into his consulting business and she then starts to support it and they start to produce content, now all of a sudden it makes pretty good sense to start taking photos and doing small videos and starting to share their point of view on the matter. So that was kind of a reverse one where the long term made more sense than the short term. But that's the nice thing about evaluating, and the question set that I use and Savory uses is it has both a present and a future sense to see, where does this decision lay in terms of bringing about these values presently, in the long term, or more ideally both.
And how often do you want to go back and check?
So one of the interesting things that I've done with context, which is unique, is I do spot checks. And this was from a great colleague of mine, Dan Palmer of Very Edible Gardens. And so all my clients continue with spot checks. We do spot checks monthly or weekly. Personally, I do my spot checks monthly at this point. And I look at my context, and it's very simple. Is this true or is this not? And we get a sense of the context if it's true or not. And during those times, we go back to decisions we've made. And as we made those decisions, part of the process is, what are the social, economic, and ecological indicators that this is a good or a bad decision. And I check in with those indicators. Did this make good sense? Did I make a good choice here? Because the whole point of this is to refine your decision-making process, not necessarily make it perfect off the bat. This is a tool to refine your personal process with, but it hones as you use it. So I check in with my decisions once a month when I do my spot checks. And then once a year, I take a look at the big decisions I did over the last year and take a look and see if they moved me in the right direction.
So one of the things too that we see is farmers working way too many hours and not getting to, even stop and take time to think about these things. Do you have simple ways that you see farmers being able to kind of like slow their life down?
Yeah, for sure. So at the risk of farmers swearing at me as I speak without the ability to be heard back, I'm going to say you're probably going to be upset with me right off the bat. So we'll just get that out of the way. First and foremost, if we are too busy to think, we're too busy to prioritize, we're too busy to do any of the things we normally do, in the same way as if you don't have 5 minutes to meditate, you need an hour. This is one of the biggest indicators that we are overcommitted with our work, or there is an inefficiency within our workflow. And immediately I would start to go into crisis mode, which is, what can I let go of? What is not producing income? What is not producing anything towards what I absolutely need to survive? That's where I start with people who are in crisis.
Okay.
I pull them back from the edge immediately. And once we get a bit of space, and that is, we're working at 90% capacity, 80% capacity, because we're always trying to move down to that 80 or 60% capacity. And why that? Because we always take a look at models. Now, all models are false, but some are useful, which is a wonderful saying from a mathematician. It's never going to be reality. But one of the models I really enjoyed was that aquaponics in particular operates at anywhere between 60 and 80% capacity because it is a living system that is constrained by technology, which means it needs ebbs and flows. So do we. We need ebbs and flows. They come to us, they're useful to us, but we need space for those ebbs and flows to happen in our life. And if they're not there, they tend to tank us pretty quickly. Humans can deal with high amounts of stress for short periods of durations really well, but low amounts of stress for long durations is pretty much guaranteed for some kind of health problem. So first and foremost, we try to take a look at anything that we can get rid of via negativa, design by subtraction. What is not supporting my bottom line? What is not supporting my life? What is not supporting me? And almost always it's extra pieces that we think we should be doing in our lives, on our farms, on our enterprises.
We feel guilted into doing.
Absolutely. By the people who own the farm, the people who gave us the farm, the people around us who are farmers themselves. We are running our lives based on false beliefs that don't fit our context. And so we can intersect with that. We can intervene by just saying, great, what isn't serving me? And right off the bat, get rid of it. And this is a basis for another tool that I've put into my context work, which is the daily statement of purpose. Say we talked about the destiny statement of purpose, which for me, again, was a bit more hallmarky. It's like, what's the big vision? But for me, I want to change things on a day-to-day basis. So I take the major weak link today, turn it into a positive, and then have that be the filter in which I filter out my day. So I was just talking with a farmer 2 days ago, and their major weak link was they just can't hold water on their soil.
Yeah.
So the daily statement of purpose became, I hold an abundance of water in my soil. And when they said that to themselves, and it wasn't true, they said, great, how can I do that today? What's one small step that I can move the needle on that and start to improve upon that? So that's the second thing, is really starting to address your problems in a systematic way. The third is during downtimes, during down seasons, because again, in crisis, you have to keep the flywheel of your production going. It's very hard to take a step back. During those moments of downtime, be it between either cropping or between transition of production systems, come back to what it is that you love about your life. Is it a fishing trip? Is it time with family? Is it making music? And plan that first. look at the calendar year and plan those moments first and hold to them. Listen, if life becomes so frustrating to live that you're not keen on doing it anymore, it doesn't matter if you get the crop in the ground, doesn't matter if you harvest it, doesn't matter if you dry it or store it or ferment it, it will very quickly not matter. I tend to see people either super proactive or who are at their last wits. And I see very few people in between because they're managing, right? They're on the surfboard and they're still kind of up. It's not great, but they're doing it. So when you look at that, when you look at how people are, self-care needs to be managed first and foremost. And if it's 5 minutes at the end of the day, if it's 10 minutes at the end of the day, inroading of muscle happens because we take rest. Our muscles grow because we put them under strain and stress, high amounts of stress, short duration, and then we give it rest. And then our muscles grow back to that point, and then they produce more muscle in anticipation of something that might come in the future. So similarly, you have to put down the stresses of farming for a period of time daily. You need micro recovery. This comes from psychology. You need to put it down for a little bit. You know, if it's the end of the day and watching the sunset, having a cigar and having a whiskey, that may or may not be the way I do it. When things are intense, so be it. And I don't tell anybody I'm going to my spot. I go to my spot, I have my whiskey, I have my cigar, and I take a breather. And I go, okay, it's not as bad as I thought it was. Spending that time with myself, with nature, with whiskey, with cigars, gives me a chance to decompress, gives my mind a chance to unwind. And that's my way. It's not going to be your way. For people, it might be pulling out and doing some music. It might be taking a drive. It might be going for a fishing trip. It might be just sitting in a place that is not the farm, so there isn't something to look at that they still have to do. This is pretty big for folks that live in a place that always has the indicators of the next project, is removing yourself from that for an evening, a day, a weekend, whatever it might be, an hour, and just saying, great, I'm not going to look at something that I know I need to do. I'm going to go take a look at water. Water has an incredible way of resetting the brain, as does moving grass or moving trees. It has a great way of reducing the stress on the parasympathetic nervous system and the vagus nerve. That can really calm and relax and move into that self-care. And then as you find these little oases, start to connect them day to day, week to week, month to month, and really start to question. And this is great because when you do, you question, well, what am I living for if this isn't enjoyable? One of my favorite tweets was, I don't know why life costs so much. I'm not even enjoying myself anyways.
Yes. Yeah, no, that is really good. Wow. So another thing you mentioned too is getting things done versus getting the right things done. And I think that ties right into all of this.
Yeah, you know, I'm from Alberta and we have a real get her done mentality. You know, it's a slogan. Basically, a lot of oil sands companies have made get her done their de facto slogan. But my question to that was always, are you getting the right things done? There's also this thing about winning in Albertan culture. I remember tiling a bathroom and the boss came in and was like, you're winning? Like, I'm putting tile down that's straight and level, and I'm working at a good pace, but it's not a game and there's no points. You know, the winning is having the money to then educate myself to go and do the things that are at the core of who I am and my zones of brilliance. So yeah, I guess, but that wasn't the intent of it, right? It's always this gamification and moving forward. And so it really becomes not getting the things done, but are we getting the right things done for me? And a Notre Dame football coach reconceptualized that by turning win into an acronym. What's important now in this moment, right where we are today? What's important today in this moment? And it might be getting up and moving, which is exactly what I'm going to do after sitting here with you for about an hour and a half. I'm going to move my body because my body's going, by the way, we've been sitting for an hour and I don't like it.
Yeah.
So that for me, that would be the win. And then the next thing will be getting ready for the marketing meeting for the next documentary. And after that, it'll be getting back to the land-based client who's just sent me a bunch of new information about their farm and the new mapping process we went to. But really taking it in a step-by-step process, not just get it done to get it done. Because if we take that effect, we take a look at the success of the economy being GDP, which sure for the economy might be a metric. It has nothing to do with happiness. But think about that for a second. A divorce has an incredible rise of GDP because of all of the separation and the lawyer fees and all the rest of it. But it doesn't increase quality of life. It doesn't get the right things done.
No.
Let me pause there. It might actually. But the big thing is that are we doing the things that actually improve our quality of life? Does our quality of life improve? And if so, great. We're probably doing the right things. But if not, we really need to think about if this is what we want to be doing.
Absolutely. With that, I'd like to stop here and take a quick break. In a minute, we'll be back. If you've been enjoying this episode so far, you're going to want to head over to growingfarmers.com/free resources and download our free resource bundle to help you shave hours off your week and become a thriving farmer. It includes resources such as our 10 winter growing secrets we wish we knew when we started, which is a ebook which talks about the tips and techniques to get better growth in your winter production. We teach things like the simple but counterintuitive principle that trips up most beginning growers, the shape and size of tunnels that are best for winter production, how to prepare beds so they are weed-free and get beautiful, lush stands of crops, what to do about pests like aphids, voles, and slugs, how to fast-track your research to fine-tune your production for your microclimate, and how to pack in more crops for higher yields and profits. So head over to growingfarmers.com/free resources and download your free resource bundle today. And we are back with Javen. And Javen, talk to us about beginning farmers, because you've now worked with for a number of years in the regenerative ag space. And so you've talked to a bunch of beginning farmers. What do you think is the biggest mistake that beginning farmers are making?
Not being inoculated against other people's biases.
Ooh.
So not having the inoculation that lets you go, oh, that's a neat idea. I'm going to see if that fits first my beliefs, first my farm's inherent characteristics, and thirdly, the regulations on my farm. And then does that actually fit who I am as a person? Is that something I'm actually interested in? Regenerative or alternative farmers are as susceptible with this as conventional farmers. They watch the Joel Saltons of the world, they watch the Mark Shepherds, they watch the Gabe Browns, and they go, that's me, that's what I have to do. And we're built this way. We're built to be evangelists, ecstatic evangelists that just like, oh, have you heard? Have you seen? Do you know? Instead of, interesting. That's a really interesting process. I wonder if that makes sense for me, which I think that's the mistake of not then inoculating yourself against other farmers' biases. And that's really where that value-based process, that holistic context comes into play. And colleague Dakota Cohen called the work that we did on context an inoculation against others' biases, societies, friends, farmers. So that way, when you do get into farming or you start to play with farming, and I think everybody should experiment with some kind of production, some kind of thing that produces from a landscape, leaves it better than before, and then has a product in which they can work with, use, play with. I've seen an incredible array of clients over the years realize they aren't farmers, but they do like producing a product. They do like producing, for example, an amazing garlic chutney that just blows my mind every time that I taste it. That's an amazing product. And so great, you've got a little boring stream of income that you know how to do, and you can create, and you can put out, and you can produce some value. But unless you inoculate your beliefs against the rest of society and then evaluate those beliefs to see if they're a good fit, chances are you're going to make a lot of mistakes off the bat.
I was recently at a conference, and one of the women that we've been working with for probably now 2 years now, she actually took me by the arm and walked me up to somebody else who was a previous generation of farmer. And she said, Michael, this guy tells me I can't go full time and my husband shouldn't quit his job and come to the farm. And I was like, well, let's talk about that. And, working with this woman, I know she can do it. I mean, they are crushing it. In 2 years, they've hired their first employee already. They're in the best markets in the area. They're just a beautiful farm. And so I was just talking to him about, why do you believe that? 'cause I just wanted to kind of hear what they were thinking.
Mhm.
Obviously a lot of it came back from, him growing up in the Depression and him just, going
Mm.
through that and his parents experiencing that. And, just that you'll never make enough money on your farm to actually make a living and, your healthcare and all that kind of thing. And, I think the healthcare is actually very reasonable thing to think about. It's something that I think, especially in the States here, and I'm not sure what it is in Canada, but the healthcare premiums are just skyrocketing every single year. But you're absolutely right with that. Inoculating against others' biases is so huge, because you're right. You go to these farming conferences and you get all these people that are burned out and just frustrated from farming or interning. And like, well, obviously if I have to be, if the farm has to have 16 interns and we all get paid $5 an hour, then the farm is not sustainable.
Mhm.
And so if they've been inoculated with that, there's no way for them to look at the farms that are successful and say, oh, this actually can work.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, I think you've hit the nail on the head there. When you don't take the time to understand your beliefs, or you don't take the time to see the full cost of the farm, then you're going to be working backwards from the moment you begin.
Uh-huh. 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 So what are some common mistakes that you see more advanced farmers making in their businesses?
They don't conduct pre-mortems. They don't conduct assessments to see why a new enterprise, why a new crop may or may not fail.
Uh-huh.
They don't take the time to precog what could save time, money, and energy in field. So when you're looking at a new enterprise, when you're taking a look at a new implement, doing the precog work, going through a values-based decision-making process, understanding what the upside of down is and the downside of up, which is a more simplified way of looking at it, which is, if I buy said implement, if I put in said crop, if I expand said herd, what's the upside? Well, the
Uh-huh.
upside is I could potentially make more money. Great. How much?
Uh-huh.
Great. What's the downside of up? Well, it's going to take more labor. It's going to take some cost, and there's a higher amount of risk because now I'm spreading out my attention over a bigger amount of active production.
Uh-huh.
And not doing that pre-mortem and post-mortem really can create an issue. It doesn't allow you to look at it. You just go from thing to thing to thing to thing to thing. The other thing that I found, especially in my recent travels and education, was just not being aware of ecological processes. I was shocked when I sat down with some of these folks. And once you're into BC, you're into forest country, and once you're into
Uh-huh.
northern BC, you're into interior boreal rainforest, which some of those rainforests are actually rainforests because of snow melt. They get so much
Oh,
snow that
wow.
they're considered rainforests. There's a ancient forest up there that's actually being considered for a UNESCO World Heritage Site because it's a rainforest of snow. And as I'm speaking with those folks, and as I'm talking to them, as we sit down for these curiosity consults in the afternoon, where I'm curious because I've never seen their land and I can't
Uh-huh.
give them a recommendation, but I can be curious about some things. They show me pastures inside a forest, and I say, so what do you want to do with these pastures? Well, they're too wet in the winter and they're too dry in the summer. I'm like, okay. So
Uh-huh.
what was in these pastures before they were pastures? Well, trees. I said, okay. So as long as you and I can agree that this was a treed ecology, that you are actively pushing a stone uphill to make a pastured ecology, we can start to have a conversation.
Uh-huh.
And you see this wry smile come across them, and they look at you and they go, oh.
Uh-huh.
It's like, I get it. Cattle are relatively easy to do up there. If we take a look at all different types of enterprises, there's a big market. I totally get it. But at the same time, let's understand that pasture actively wants to become a forest. And when I say that, and they go, well, yeah, the trees are always trying to get back into it. It's like, well,
Yes.
that's a good sign. That's a good sign that this is something that wants to become a forest. So if we're going to take on the task of keeping a pasture in a forest ecology, great. Let's start there. And let's talk about root infiltration. And let's talk about silviculture. And let's talk about agroforestry. Let's talk about integration, because
Uh-huh.
the only way we're going to start to dehydrate that pasture when you want it dehydrated, and rehydrate that pasture when you want it rehydrated is probably working with some kind of tree culture within that pasture to help
Absolutely.
hold and store that moisture and keep things shaded. And of course, keeping the wind off animals, which can account for anywhere between 10 to 30% of body loss. All of those things start to work together. And then we start to mimic, as others have said, savanna. We start to mimic the patterns we already see.
Fascinating. That I never heard that statistic of the 10 to 30% of body loss from just is it just wind? Okay.
Yeah. It's a huge amount of effort to raise the body temperature against wind, and the biological functionality that happens within pretty much all mammalia really does drop with wind, and probably outside of mammalia, but that's where the information comes from. So if you're in, and this is really from a lot of prairie farming back from where I was born, and is one of the reasons why the Alberta government puts so much money into shelter belts, and there was a shelter belt program for years, is because it does have such a positive impact on weight gain on animals.
Absolutely. So what do you think is the largest challenge that's facing farmers these days?
Well, that's really going to be site specific. When you take a look at Canadian farmers, I would say it's largely an uneducated public. I think the largest gains a farmer has to make in their food is probably direct sale or aggregated sale. And when the public doesn't realize that food equals health, that food is where health comes from, we are what we eat, and if we eat garbage, we are garbage, that becomes a big problem. I recently was listening to Gabe Brown and his work with an oncologist down the States who has said this over and over, that food is the primary driver for inflammation, and inflammation is the primary driver for cancer. So when you have a public that thinks that the food pyramid, at least that's what it's called in Canada, I don't know if it's the same in the States.
Yeah, we have a plate system now they use.
A plate system, okay. But that the food pyramid has something to do with nutrition, it's just mental. It's just totally out the window. You need to have dynamically grown and raised food that's raised on really fertile soil to be healthy, to have a full constituent of not just the macronutrients of fat, of protein, of carbohydrates and fiber, but of the micronutrients, of the enzymes, of the amino acids, of the vitamins. This was a big dive I did last year. I was a high priest of the BRICS refractometer as nutrition, but unfortunately, the refractometer only measures solids in solution. And when you take a vegetative sample and you squeeze that vegetative sample, there's other things that are solids that are in that solution besides sucrose, which technically is the BRICS meter. And that was, again, one of these amazing moments of going, oh, this actually doesn't give us a full comprehensive analysis of nutrition. It tells us what's solid in that material, and we can make assumptions that some of that is fat and protein and hopefully carbohydrates, and those carbohydrates are hopefully sucrose, but it is not a direct scale of measurement. So really starting to invest heavily in nutrition, starting to invest highly in nutrient dense nutrition. Again, I point to my colleague Dakota Cohen, who had his meat tested, and it came back higher in omega-3, 6, and 9 than fish because of the way he was grazing and because of the way he was managing. Now we have metrics that we can work with, and educating a public upon that, which he has done, has created an incredible demand for his product because people know that it is nutrient dense. And while it might be, I don't know the percentages of how much more expensive it is than Costco meat, but it's incredibly flavored, it's incredibly dense, and you can feel the vitality from that food. And it's something that we are so removed from, the idea of eating food and feeling vital force, that when we feel it, sometimes we think we're having a different experience, or it's like, maybe I'm flush or maybe I don't feel well. But when you eat food that has that vitality, you do feel more energized. And I think that's what we're really facing with farmers today, is that people are equating food from a big chain grocery store with food that comes off farm, and they are not the same product, not by miles.
So you think it's just a matter of the education aspect, is just that and I think that there's work being done, but I think the problem is that it's all uphill. because there is so many companies advertising with poor quality food that just trying to get out that information is just very challenging.
It's super challenging. And that's why when you said the biggest challenge, I thought about it and I thought, well, this is the biggest challenge. We fundamentally have a population that doesn't understand the reality of food. Think about that. They're under an illusion or a delusion about food, that if something comes from a plastic bag, it's food. If something comes off a shelf, it's food. If we have irradiated food that comes in across border, which is pretty standard practice to irradiate that food due to contamination issues, then that food has the same vital force as an apple that you grow on your property or from the farmer that you make a direct, face-to-face, hand-to-hand relationship with. That's wrong. That is incorrect. You couldn't be more incorrect. And so while I agree with Joel, stay out of the center of the grocery store, further, stay out of the grocery store as much as possible. Make direct relationships with farmer. Start to buy your food in bulk from reputable individuals. And start to buy seconds, start to buy thirds, start to buy food, start to learn how to can and grow your own, because all of that starts to produce more vitality for your farmer. But for the majority of the population who doesn't live in rural aspects, who doesn't have access to land, just get to know your farmer and realize that that is where your nutrition comes from, which again, I'm aware that the Growing Farmers podcast, I'm speaking to a Church of the Converted, but that I would say is probably the biggest challenge, because you have essentially a public that is being misled, lied to, and misguided to food products that are biofortified instead of food that is naturally grown.
So I think the message you're saying to the folks listening is you need to keep pounding to your customers, and not pounding, but just keep repeating and keep repeating and keep repeating about how much better quality and how much more healthy and how it's going to decrease the trips to the doctor that their food is compared to the grocery store.
Yeah, and it's a cultural currency. You know, in the States, the few farmers that I've worked with in the States, it's really about making a comparative analysis to the cost of healthcare, because that is such a detractor for living in the States.
Well, and just the copays now.
Yeah.
I mean, like if a CSA is a quarter of a copay. I mean, like I was at a local school board, they have like a $6,000 copay now for their insurance. And like, you know, one of the most expensive CSAs, we had a very expensive one. We were 12 months and there was like $1,500.
Yeah.
So I'm like, think of the cost right here, guys.
Yeah. It's exactly the same. It's understanding the financial outlay for the total benefit, which is really a value proposition. Right? Yeah. This is how to make a value proposition, which is, do you want to eat nutrient dense food, or do you want to be at higher risk for infection, for mutable pathogen, for general malaise and issues that will decrease your quality of life?
Yeah. And no one wants to spend time in the doctor's office.
Spend time in the doctor's office, spend time off work, spend time, you know, needing to take care of your kids, you know, all
feeling
of that.
Like crap.
Yeah. All of that comes down to, what do you put in your mouth and how do you treat your body?
All right, let's wrap up here. But first, I want to talk about your Facing Fire documentary, because that was such a cool project you did. How did that come about?
Yeah, so I ended up making a doc called Facing Fire, Building Resiliency to Wildfire. And you can find out more about it at facingfirefilm.com. And my brother is an award-winning cinematographer in Alberta, Javan Bernakevitch. And he saw that there was a grant to put out a short film. And he said, well, let's do it about your work. Let's do it about regenerative land design and agriculture, maybe permaculture. But the production schedule was over the winter, which isn't very photogenic for anything agriculture in Canada. So I said, well, why don't we take a look at a major problem in North America and talk about the solutions that come from land design and working with instead of against nature, which is, again, a fundamental principle of my work. So we looked at three major questions. How did we get here? Where are we now? And what can we do about it? And that's what produced this 22-minute documentary that took a look at First Nations and individuals that were working with agriculture and otherwise, but really being able to address a major problem through pretty simple approaches.
All right. So the three questions was, how do we get here? The second one was,
where are we now?
Where are we now? The final
third was, what can we do about it?
Okay. Gotcha. I just wanted to write that down.
No worries.
And so I think something too is that us East Coasters sometimes can't even comprehend fire like you guys see on the West Coast, or as we've just seen now ravage Australia for the last couple months. Talk to us a little bit about why we're seeing that.
Sure. So we and life on this planet evolved with fire.
Mm-hmm.
Once there was vegetation, once there was something to burn, there was wildfire. There was fire before that. There was chemical fire. There was friction fire. But before vegetation, there wasn't necessarily wildfire. And once there was wildfire, vegetation co-evolved with fire. We have many species of trees that have serotinous cones. That means that cones are seeds that need heat to release. There are species in Australia that actually need smoke to pollinate, which was
wow.
fascinating to learn. And a lot of different types of ecological structures, especially revitalization and regeneration, requires fire. So you have these 4.5 billion years, of which a certain amount, when we start to get into vegetation, starts to have fire. Then you have indigenous populations the world over. And again, we were all indigenous of some place at some time that then worked with fire. My people from the Ukraine worked from fire. Of course they did. Fire was one of the major ways that we adapted ourselves to our landscape. And again, that goes back to our initial conversation about what is design. And now we get into North America and we get into Australia and other places. And for us in North America, about 120 years ago, we start to create pretty massive forestry practices that produce these massive piles of logs called slash, which is fuel.
Yeah.
And then we have the advent of the railroad, which increases the amount of ignition into dry fuel landscapes. And we tell the indigenous population, well, first we commit genocide against them. And then we tell the remaining numbers that they're outlawed to actively work with fire, which they're flabbergasted by. I have this amazing story I found about a forester from Fort McMurray that was walking with some First Nations on a forestry crew in the early 1900s. And he was late and he wasn't that fit. So he was lagging behind these First Nation folks. And he came across fires on these trails in spring. And he kept on putting out these fires, and he's shocked he's seeing fire on the trails. Well, he finally comes across the First Nations who have started another fire on the trail and they're warming up lunch, and he berates them. He just tears a strip out of them. And he goes, and the First Nations go, well, how do you think this trail is managed? And it was a big aha moment for him. And even at the time, around the 1910s, we have an amazing collection of foresters and the nascent wildland firefighting organizations in your country come together and say, listen, we might need to rethink our concept that First Nation practices around fire weren't useful or were savage or primitive and all those ridiculous words they used. We may have to rethink this, but no, they chose exclusion and suppression. And so now we have 120 years of exclusion and suppression. World War II, there's a huge amount of surplus material, as well as command structure, which then gets rolled into the Wildland Fire Service and the Bureau of Land Management in your country.
So they needed an outlet for people, so they just sent them to fight fire.
To a big extent, right? Where do we take this material and where do we repurpose? 1940s, we get Smokey the Bear, only you can prevent forest fires, and really the demonization of fire, that fire is bad. But it's interesting. It's not the same all across your country. You know, Florida burns something like 2 to 3 million acres a year in prescribed fire.
Oh, wow.
And so just as, you know, a Californian father would teach his son to find smoke and put out the fire, a Floridian, I think is how you say it.
Yes, you can. Yes.
A Floridian father would teach his son, or grandfather would teach his grandson how to start fire and how to actively manage landscape. So this is not totally dead. We know that we can use fire. We know we can work with fire. But at this point, our fuel loads are so massive because we've had exclusion and we've had suppression that a lot of these forests really just aren't safe to burn at scale. Which means that what do we do next is really start to adopt in community small fire lighting and prescribed burning community groups and associations that actively go in and start burning, first and foremost around facility areas and human habitation, to create fire breaks, and then starting to move throughout forests in a systematic, a verifiable, a permitted way. I am not saying, don't anybody email me, that people should willy-nilly go into the forest and light fires. I am not saying that.
Mm-hmm.
What I'm saying is that we need to systematically start introducing fire into the forests because they need it as much as we do.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So the government has been changing, or what's the current status on the West Coast now?
Yeah, we have seen changes. And it's funny, the municipal governments and the regional governments are actually quicker to change than the provincial or the federal governments.
Mm-hmm.
And I would
Mm-hmm.
say that's true as well down in the States, because people are more likely to act where they're seeing the damage or where they are at damage.
Mm-hmm.
So local municipalities have been bringing on consultants to do test burns to show the efficacy of it, which is hilarious to think that we have to have a test to see if fire is valuable. But I get it. We've been under the
Yeah.
dominion of a pure scientific reductionist mentality for far too long. And it's great. It's good. Science is fantastic. But without an understanding that we live in ecology, it's kind of ridiculous, truthfully. So the government response has been good. There's been box and burn strategies in your country. There's been support of indigenous burning. Last year, I was part of a TREX, a training exchange that the Nature Conservancy puts on. And we were in Yurok territory in Northwest California with an association called the Cultural Fire Management Council. And we had people from all over. We had people from the Bureau of Land Management. We had people, private firefighters, which is very popular in your country, I learned.
Mm-hmm.
We had folks from Canada. We had folks internationally, a couple from Spain. And people are learning. And I got to tell you, Michael, it's a cellular baptism because my cells remember in my ancestry that we used fire. I was in the smoke. I was lighting fire. I was managing the fire. And there was a sense of homecoming that I very seldomly felt. And it was a low intensity. It was a slow intensity fire.
Mm-hmm.
These are not wildfires. These are managed. And when we use these design processes to talk about fire as a tool, all of a sudden we change the conversation. And, folks like Savory talked about fire as a tool, but nobody has an active process about how to use it. And
Yeah.
that's really been a great, again, curiosity, going back to what a light and ignites me. So I'm training right now to be a wildland firefighter and a fire lighter.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I find that humorous that you use the word ignite.
It all comes together.
Yes, it
All
does.
comes together.
If you could pick one, what would be your favorite farming tool?
Broken record, here I am again, but values-based decision-making.
Mm-hmm.
I have found values-based decision-making to be the most useful farming process, the most useful gardening process, the most useful land design process I've found.
Mm-hmm.
Outside of that, it would be working within and inside the natural blueprint of the climax ecology, both the flora and fauna. And then after that, it would be working with the keyline scale of permanence for all things agricultural.
Yep.
And Darren Doherty's amazing work with the Regrarians platform. I can't speak highly enough of that and his workplace. Such a great place for folks who are in alternative regenerative agriculture to talk to others. You don't necessarily have to follow the blueprint of the Regrarians platform to be part of that, but you can definitely see the value of it. So in order, values-based decision-making, working inside the blueprint of climax ecology, both flora and fauna, and making sure that your decisions for production are based within that and based within your values, first and foremost, and then working with that keyline scale of permanence in whatever form you find it. There's lots of folks that are using the keyline scale of permanence under different names these days. So, 70, 80 years, it's definitely proven the test of time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And if folks want to go back and listen to Darren, who actually was on our podcast, that's episode 25. So they can hear him talk in more detail about that. And, Darren is just a fun guy to chat with because he's, he can go. So, yes.
Well, you have to imagine, you take a look at everybody who's worked on farms as a farm planner. Darren has at least 1,000, if not 1,500 active farms designed, planned in the ground under his belt.
Mm-hmm.
And they're still talking to him to this day.
And there's some of those are massive farms.
Yeah. The Mars project was massive. And there were others, Mars Corporation, Mars Bar Corporation. And that's really the question. Who are we taking and who are we following and whose advice are we playing with? Are we playing with folks that are working at scale? Are we getting advice from folks that are working at scale and working across, not just does it look beautiful, but is it functional? And not only is it functional, is it profitable? I think all of those are really important questions for folks to ask themselves before they seek out advice and guidance.
Absolutely. Do you believe that now is the best time to start a farm?
It's like planting a tree. You
Hmm.
know, the best time to plant a tree was 30, 40 years ago. The next best time is now. Fragility is the name of the game currently in our world. Our world is very fragile. We have lots of single points of failure.
Hmm.
Our reliance on science, our reliance on reduced engineering from an ecological standpoint, our lack of understanding of ecology has made a really fragile world. And to that point, we've really domesticated humans over the last 14,000 years since the advent of agriculture, to the point to where most of our grandparents and great grandparents would just abhor, pardon me, the lack of skill we have, the lack of understanding we have. We press buttons to make things happen. We press buttons to take away our feces and our urine. We press buttons to get our food. We press buttons to get somebody to come in and do the work that we potentially could learn about ourselves.
Hmm.
So inherently creating anti-fragility, systems that grow from volatility, that improve upon themselves, not just sustainable, not just resilient, moving to regenerative, getting to anti-fragile. So we are actively creating our lives and our landscapes. Absolutely. Farming is one of those tools. Farming is one of those skills that will consistently and more so be in demand as long as we can get over that challenge of making sure that people understand that nutrient dense food really comes from food, first and foremost.
Hmm. 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 Where can people find out more about you and your work?
Yeah. So my company is called All Points Design. That's allpointsdesign.ca. And if you're interested in just the life design, you can go right to it with All Points Life. I've got a YouTube channel. We've got a number of podcasts. So if you go to allpointsdesign.ca/podcast, you can see all the different podcasts I've been in. I'll probably post that this up there. And I'm just in the process of producing and releasing my own podcast after many years of producing content for it, and finally having the time, as all value-based decisions do come to,
Hmm.
called Land and Life with Javen. So look for that. And if you want to, there's a sign up on allpointsdesign.ca/podcast about that.
Very cool. Yeah, I will definitely be listening to that one. I don't have a lot of time these days to listen to podcasts, unfortunately, because I spend so many hours in the office. But that's one of my my value-based decisions is I'm trying to spend less time in the office. So
Nice.
when
Nice.
that happens, I will have more time for podcasts, and definitely look forward to yours because, yeah, this is good stuff, and it's such important things for our farmers to understand and to feel. Because I think it's not just the aspects of how do I put a seed in the ground, but there is 999 other things they need to be thinking about as they're building out their farms, and so much of it is the big picture about their farm and just the holistic aspects of that.
Absolutely. And it goes back to one of your forefathers down in the States. If I have to chop down a tree, I'm going to take 90% of the time to really sharpen that axe and
Uh-huh.
understand where I'm going to place that axe instead of just constantly putting things in the ground. And this can go back and forth between that analysis paralysis you were talking about. But fundamentally, if you don't design your life, it's going to be designed for you. And you're going
Uh-huh.
to operate underneath that constraint and those beliefs. So really making sure that you design the aspects of your life, your farm, your situation to a really high degree, and you challenge the beliefs you have about farming, all aspects of it, and then take the time to evaluate, is this a good idea? And then do a small experiment, see if it works, and then really try to make things boring on the farm. Do things that make good sense, do things that don't take a lot of energy, and then start to build reliable workhorses, reliable flywheels, and then do little experiments. I found that to be very useful for the clients I work with.
Uh-huh. 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 Well, Javan, thank you so much for your time today. Really appreciate it. I know our audience is going to absolutely love this. So again, just thank you so much for your time, and can't wait to connect in the future.
Thanks so much, Michael. And thanks so much, everybody listening. If you found it useful, feel free to reach out to me or reach out to Michael. Love hearing about all that good feedback.
Yeah. And we'll put all your information in the show notes as well. So they can just, the show notes we do all the takeaways, and there's going to be a ton because this is like a long episode and there's just so much good stuff there. But yeah, it's going to be fabulous. Thanks again. All right. Have a great rest of your day.
Bye now.
Bye. All right. Make sure you run over to www.growingfarmers.com/swag and score your Thriving Farmer t-shirts. Now, these are limited edition. These are pop-up shops, so we only do it every so often, periodically. It's only open for a few more days. So make sure you type on over to growingfarmers.com/swag and reserve your Thriving Farmer t-shirts today. Hey, Thriving Farmers. Next week on the show, we have Ken Mishka, who is the founder and chef farmer at the Epiphany Hospitality Group, which is Farm to Table 2.0, according to the Wall Street Journal. Ken and I had a fascinating conversation. It was so cool to talk to him about building a farm and building a company devoted to doing farm to table with a restaurant group. So he's incredibly open with how he runs his companies, how they've built it from literally nothing to where it is today with multiple restaurants. And can't wait for you to join me in listening to this fascinating interview with Ken. So there you have it, another episode in the books. So I'd love if you would hop on over to iTunes and leave us a rating and a review. Those mean everything to us. We love to hear what you're thinking. If you have a podcast guest that you can recommend, please pop on over to the Thriving Farmer Podcast website and leave us a review. That's thrivingfarmerpodcast.com.